Hey everyone, welcome to Cologne. Yes, Digital Foundry is attending Gamescom this year, and last night we were at the Nvidia reveal of GTX 2070, GTX 2080 and the new TI model. We saw a lot of interesting stuff, and to talk us through it all, my colleague John Linneman.
Hey Rich, how's it going?
Yeah, not too bad. And for the first time on camera, not a trick, not an illusion, it is Alex Battaglia.
Nice to see everyone.
Yep, good stuff.
Excellent.
So where do we begin? Ray tracing, is it a game changer, or is it, as one commenter puts it, Hairworks 2.0?
It's not at all Hairworks 2.0. It's going to be a fundamental difference in the way we do graphics in the future. But the question is, I think, is how nascent is it right now? It's going to be limited as we see it to basically one set of hardware for the foreseeable future, and just on Nvidia mainly. So its penetration into engines, I think, is the bigger question.
I think the thing here is that it needs to be easy to implement. And two, I think people are going to have to be accepting that this is kind of a paradigm shift in rendering, and that there is going to be some teething room here, because it's just like we've become so accustomed to super high frame rates in the PC, super high resolutions. What we saw suggests that there's still great performance to be had even when the RT is running. But I think it's not going to be quite what people are used to. But I think the visual, what you get in return is absolutely worth it. And it's where rendering is going. It's just going to take time to fully get there. This is the first step.
I think Nvidia also tried to make that point in the presentation at one point, even though it is a bit PR-ish, with them changing the way they present their flop data, how many flops a chip has, with their specific moniker for how many, I forget the name of the moniker, but the ray tracing flops with the tensor core flops with the normal rasterization flops all added together. The giga-rays. They tried to make it seem like, okay, in the future we can't just talk about the normal rasterization performance of a chip, but how it also does other things. Whether or not the AI tensor core proportion is actually that important is also another question. But in general, just nascent days, we're seeing it on a limited set of hardware. How much integration into engines is really the key thing. Looking at that presentation though, already a couple of demos in real time, on hand, on stage, and the listing of games that you could see that will be incorporating RTX in some proportion was pretty impressive, more than I thought.
We saw it on several different games as well.
We did too.
Both obviously during the demo, but then there was stuff on the show floor, like what we saw Resident Evil 2, the remake with its new reflections. There was Metro, a few others like that, but it was immediately apparent. Like for instance, one benefit, I think a lot of people when they see reflections used heavily in games, the screen space reflections are one of the biggest issues. Whereas in a third-person game like Resident Evil, where the character sort of occludes part of the scene, so there's no data to pull from. So like the arm would often cause issues with the reflections on the floor, where it seems like at least in some of the scenes where they may have been using that, the reflections are basically perfect.
Yeah, there's just a much more stable image that your eye is accustomed to. I think a big part of the demo was them, especially with the Battlefield 5 one, they had to zoom in on such surfaces to show you the difference, because at eye level, whether you could actually always see that if you're just playing a game for its competitive aspects, maybe it's not a big deal. But if you zoom in, the difference is pretty much immediately apparent, I think, at that exact moment. Like being able to see behind a structure with its reflections, that was pretty mind-blowing for me. I hadn't seen that in games ever. Yeah.
Right. I think from my perspective, there's a couple of things here that are sort of interesting, which is, first of all, this is a tough sell, because fundamentally every time a new GPU comes along, it's defined by the number of percent faster it is than the previous one. And so there was none of that in the presentation last night. And so, there are questions. I mean, I can break out my Crysis 3 benchmark. How many percent is it faster than the 1080 Ti, the 2080 and the 2080 Ti? Those are the questions which they didn't even address, because they've got bigger fish to fry. And secondly, I kind of see this as a strategic alignment of what they're doing in automotive and deep learning with gaming. Because as we all know, designing a piece of silicon is millions, if not billions of dollars of investment in R&D. And you know, previously to this, we thought they would strip out the tensor cores for GeForce and, you know, dedicate it to more compute or make the chip smaller. But no, they've unified deep learning and ray tracing with a new hardware accelerated core into GeForce. And it's a massive gamble because I'm fairly certain that the silicon area of those new components is not going to be insignificant, and that might be why the Titan level chip that's in the 2080 Ti has fewer CUDA cores than the Titan V.
But it's huge, the chip now. But it'll be interesting as well to see, again, this could run into issues with adoption, but they did kind of suggest that like the tensor cores and the RT core could be used for other operations to a degree.
Specifically talking about their we'll talk about this, I think it's DLSS.
Yes, the DLSS.
I forget the exact name of the acronym, the DLSS, I believe, where you could download packages basically of, I think, trained data for a game through driver updates, and then you could run the game with a specific form of anti-aliasing done presumably in a post-process kind of manner that would have a more perfect image already to compare against and make basically super sampled like images, but at a much lower cost running on the tensor cores. That's the way it sounded like in the presentation. I think we'll hear about it more.
It's kind of a bit pie in the sky, sounds too good to be true. And of course the Infiltrator demo is basically a, effectively it runs in real time, but it is a predefined path through
same thing every single time.
So in terms of deep learning, it doesn't need to be particularly deep. But if they're able, and this is the other thing, they're so, again, can offer an infinite number of different configurations in terms of what you're seeing on screen at any point. So how this works, I have no idea. But in theory, if they're talking about the new card being twice as fast as 1080 Ti, this has some interesting implications for the 2070, the bottom end card, and how it might compare to a 1080 Ti, which doesn't have this feature.
Yeah, I think a traditional rasterized performance is so this is a difficult balancing act for Nvidia right now, I think, because they're trying to push forward with some new technologies, but they also need to offer significantly improved performance in the more traditional space, because that's what consumers are going to be running the most of now. And we've already seen it. You just check the online reactions and that's what everybody wants to know. Well, how fast does it run my current game compared to this?
It's all about the bar charts.
There are some bar charts there that gave us hints when they were showing the difference between doing RT on the old Volta setup, the V100s, versus the new Turing, and then also in comparison to the Pascal chip. There were also parts of the chart that said S and R, showing off their shading and rasterization performance, and you could see that they were decidedly smaller than on the Pascal side of things, but in comparison to the V100 setup, I think with the DGX chips that they had shown off there, it was actually still not as great as those. So we can't expect the DGX kind of level of rasterization performance than the high-end Turing. Obviously not, but it's better than Pascal. We just still have to wait and see, I think.
How much better?
How much better, yeah.
So let's return to the ray tracing demos. We've seen quite a few titles behind the scenes, but the big one I think at the presentation was Battlefield 5.
Yeah, I think first of all, as you know, those games do already rely a lot on reflectivity to create their environment. There's a lot of water, a lot of shiny streets and everything, and they've always relied on a mix of screen space reflections with cube maps. And especially on vertical surfaces, the SSR kind of breaks up a lot. It was always kind of shaky, not temporally stable. And this was absolutely amazing to see from the demo. It's like everything's reflected as you'd expect. And yes, it is amped up for the demo in the sense that they picked a map where this applies, but I think this will apply across the board and just help create a more realistic overall image. And I think you can talk a little bit about the way the materials are engineered already so that it should just kind of plug right in and work.
Yeah, this ties also into the how capable it is for a developer to put it into an engine. We are already in games shooting rays for a whole bunch of different things, and even for visual effects like screen space reflections. It's just a matter of which part of the world they're shooting into, screen space versus some world space structure that they build up. That's the whole point of RTX and the acceleration part of the RT cores is accelerating this acceleration structure, so that runs fast, so you can shoot as many rays as you really want to, up to 10 giga-rays apparently here, whatever that is. That's the thing. Games are already built with the materials designed around a certain form of tracing already being done. Less accurate, for the most part, with screen space reflections, or in the case of convolved cube maps, like it doesn't actually approach realism actually very much so. It's very inaccurate.
Yep.
And engines themselves also check the correctness of their materials and their shaded surfaces with the internal path tracers, which are even better than the real-time ray tracing we've seen. So them plugging in ray tracing is not going to make the materials more shiny, necessarily always, and it's also not going to make them look more unrealistic. It's just going to bring them to be more closer to ground truth. And in the end, so the demo that we saw tried to exaggerate it in the sense of what points of view they chose to show it off in, but the materials themselves are just going to act like more natural versions of what we already see in games. It shouldn't look uncanny, it should look just more realistic, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the reaction to it, because not everyone is buying into it. And I think, here's the thing, when stereoscopic 3D was presented by Sony, they were talking about how awesome depth perception would be when, you know, in actual fact, developers have actually faked depth perception in 2D exceptionally well, to the point where this huge leap wasn't so much of a huge leap. And again, to transfer that to ray tracing, I kind of think developers have been pretty good at faking it over the years. So it is, from my perspective, the first step towards proper correctness, as opposed to something that is going to be monumentally game-changing. But that said, Battlefield 5 and the DICE implementation, it's pretty awesome, isn't it?
Yeah, I was blown back, obviously, in the private demo and the real demo itself. There are a lot of things that, when you think about it in a game, have never had this before, where you could quite literally see someone behind you in a reflection and turn around to engage them in a Battlefield game. That is unheard of in a game, and I think it's a real paradigm shift for when you just think about how you interact with the game. You're so used to the fakeness of a lot of things that you take it for granted, and as soon as now that the game world's reacting like your actual eyes perceive the real world, now you're going to start having a whole new sense of perception. I don't think it's overhyped as much as the sense of 3D depth perception on 2D displays from like the Sony era that you talked about. I think it's a bit more practical and tactile and things that we're used to more when we look at images. I don't actually think it's overhyped or overblown. I think just the question is, how long do we have to wait now? Because we're already at the point where developers can do it. We saw a bunch of demos with it, especially for the reflections part, which is arguably more interesting than seeing shadows, like in the Tomb Raider demo. Still interesting because you can get shadows now from every single point light source, but not as interesting as I can actually see myself in a reflection in real time and someone behind me. That's mind-boggling.
So I think the key then comes down to how quickly and successfully this can be implemented, because as we know, it's very unlikely that anything like this is going to show up in the next generation of consoles, and a lot of people on PCs are still going to be using older GPUs or AMD GPUs without this feature, right? So the developers need to be able to implement this fairly efficiently, quickly enough, so that it's, they can do either or. So like if we look at global illumination, for instance, they're still going to have to worry about baking out different, global illumination passes for the fallback.
That was like in the Metro demo, where they showed basically the unlit scene with just direct lighting, and then they presumably showed what it looks like with RTX, without RTX on every other platform, like on PC, on consoles. It still had a form of global illumination in there, but it was less accurate. And then having to art your game on top of that fact with a more accurate ray traced global illumination, I don't know if every dev studio is going to be willing to want to spend the art time there. I mean, it's less art time arguably overall because it just works, but that means you have two separate versions of the game's lighting now. That's a big deal.
And I kind of laughed a little bit when they were pointing out like, oh, they can hide stuff up in the rafters because it's dark, as if they're going to base a gameplay decision on the RT pipe. It's like never. So it's still a little pie in the sky. Like I think we'll see a decent amount of support for it for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not. This is just the beginning.
So my next question concerns performance. Now, obviously, there's two ways to look at this. If it's standalone RT cores, are they actually separate from the rasterization side of the GPU, or is it actually intrinsically still a part, even though we have bespoke acceleration? How is it all going to balance out?
The way I saw it in the presentation is that different parts of the ray tracing steps have different involvement from different parts of the chip. So as like the beginning step still involves part of like the rasterization engine of shooting out these rays, but as soon as they're going through the structure that is built up on the GPU, that's when the RT cores come in.
Right.
But in the demos that we saw, less so the Battlefield 5 demo, which had incredible performance, I think, on stage. But the Tomb Raider demo, when they turned on those RT shadows, I did notice some wobbly frames there. And you did see much more accurate shadows, more shadows overall. An interesting thing to talk about with those shadows is there's no more shadow maps, so you don't have cascade distances anymore. Shadows in the distance always look correct. So there's a lot of things that look generally better, but you saw a performance dip on presumably a high-end Turing card on that stage, still with RT shadows on.
Yeah, I noticed, John, you were pointing out that they were doing the transitions to RT on without moving the camera.
For the most part on stage, when they would move the camera with it off, then toggle it on, and you could immediately see the motion.
The lateral movement would emphasize the frame rate drops, and the private demo. Well, let's talk about Tomb Raider because we've got some footage.
About the demo, right?
Yeah, we could. There's no embargo on that one for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So yeah, after the event, we went behind the scenes into a very dark room, crammed with Turing-powered PCs.
Oh yes.
We played Battlefield 5, which is under embargo, but there's no embargo on this stuff, and we were going to sort of spin it out into a separate video, but fundamentally it's about shadows. We can't really do like a 10-minute video about shadows.
They also demoed it poorly. I think they showed it off in a region of the game where you could see one or two aspects of how those shadows work.
Yep.
Oh, you can see that they're more diffused sometimes and a little bit crisper at times, but they didn't show off the fact that now every light source is casting shadows. It was basically one light source in the entire demo.
And we noticed some shortcomings.
Yeah, we did.
Such as the hair. Like you would have like a very diffuse shadow from the trees above, spread out on the scenery, but then when it would, you see the shadows on her head, they appeared razor sharp, which isn't correct.
It wasn't correct, and it looked really uncanny. At first, I thought I was seeing the shadow of her hair on her hair itself, on Lara's hair. I was like, what's going on? And then I only found out later, when testing it around, oh, it's just not implemented correctly at the moment. I don't know how they'll fix that for the main game. Presumably, they do a different volumetric pass for the hair shadows or something like that. But man, it was less impressive,
I think we're at a point though, like that specific type of implementation is the type of thing that people would probably turn off to save on frames, because we were running at 1080p and the frame rate, so it's 1080p on the 2080 Ti, right? I think it was a 2080
It was a
Ti.
2080 Ti in that system.
So the frame rate was dipping well below 60 regularly with this enabled. And again, this is, from what we understand with a lot of this, the developers had very little time to implement these features, right?
Yes.
So we can't say for certain that it will not improve by launch, especially we don't even know if that will be available at launch.
We don't know, but what we do know is that Nixis are doing it, and they really know their stuff.
They do know their stuff. So we can be probably confident that it will work about as best as it can at the moment. I guess the thing there is maybe focusing just on shadows, especially in a game like this, is not the best use of that hardware.
I really think the wow factor is going to be in the global illumination techniques from it, the AO techniques, and the indirect lighting of reflections. That's what the Battlefield Glows demo impressed me a lot about as well.
And the Tomb Raider demo, what they actually showed on stage was fundamentally more impressive in terms of how the shadows are deployed compared to the kind of curious gameplay slice they gave us.
Yeah, because in that onstage demo there was a lot of point lights in the scene, and those could suddenly cast shadows, which is really cool. But in the demo we saw, it was just like lit by the sun essentially, and there was 0 point lights. Well, at least nothing obvious there. So it was a very kind of dark, dim scene.
Yeah, and there was even sections of it that were completely without shadows too.
Yep.
So, yeah.
But
didn't
there
even
is
see it.
still this fundamental issue that this is going to have a cost. This is going to have a performance cost. Now, I don't think I'd be breaking the embargo to say that the Battlefield 5 performance was pretty awesome and in line with the stage demo.
Yes.
But, you know, obviously there is still going to be a cost there. But, you know, I can see, you know, this is the thing. We've been conditioned to basically having a free lunch and, you know, always having these massive gen-on-gen leaps in performance. This is going to hold back your frame rates. You're not going to want to use this with a 144 hertz 1440p or 4K
maybe with
screen.
G-Sync.
With G-Sync.
Well, yeah, obviously that would help, but you know, it is a fundamental trade, and frame rates, you know, they are going to be lower. There's no way to dress that up. Okay, so let's round this off with a discussion on pricing. So, prices start at $499 for the 2070, which isn't out on September the 20th, as I understand it. It comes along a bit later along.
October maybe?
That was a very deceptive slide. It said starting at $499, and there's a 2080 Ti image in the background, by the way, on that slide. Very hilarious.
And then it moves up to, what is it, $700?
Yeah, $699.
$699 for the 2080. And it's actually a really confusing name. I keep calling it the 1080.
I do too.
It's crazy. It doesn't roll off the tongue.
2080.
2080. We've got to get used to that. And then they said prices starting at $999 for the 2080 Ti. But then there seems to have been lots of reports this morning that it's actually a $1,200 card.
Jeez. Wait, really?
So maybe this is like AIB cards or something. But, you know, it's, I guess, the new Titan, really.
And since they're doing a Ti at launch, we only have the next Titan to think about for the future, perhaps.
Well, this is interesting because typically the way Nvidia works is they start at the 80 product, 70 comes next, 60, and then at some indeterminate point we get the Titan, and then we get the cut down Ti version, which is basically the same. But this time they've gone straight to the Ti, and I do wonder whether that is again down to rasterization performance, where, you know, the 2080 could be ballpark Titan XP. It could be slightly faster. It could be a 980 situation where it was at launch only sort of, you know, 8 to 10% faster than the 780 Ti.
Yep.
So I'm thinking that's maybe why they did it. I think the thing that surprises me is that they've got volume on a massive die.
Yeah.
which is pretty amazing. And it kind of speaks, I think, to the kind of way that Nvidia are really pushing on every front here.
I think they're also throwing out this Ti, the 2080 Ti, as early as they are in comparison to what we've seen since the 680 generation, because they have basically now with this 12 nanometer process, only a certain amount of time until they're going to move over to 7 nanometer. And usually that was a much longer time than when they had a normal product launch. So we're seeing the Ti version, I think, pushed a bit earlier because they know that they're going to be transitioning over to 7 nanometer much quicker this time between generations. So basically, instead of having a refresh down the line, that's going to be the Ti version like we would have seen in maybe 6 to 8 months after a launch like this. Maybe we'll be seeing actually in a year the successor to Turing already. Or maybe a little longer than a year, but basically when 7 nanometers out, they're going to already have a new architecture to push to the forefront.
It's possible.
This could be a gap generation almost like.
I think 7 nanometer on a big chip, on a relatively big chip, is going to be really expensive to produce, so they're kind of, I think, pushing 12 just to still be able to produce a competitively priced product, which I think is really important. I was really quite taken with the reference design. I thought it looked really good. Lots of claims being made about A, overclocking, and B, the audio acoustic profile of the card. We're saying it's, you know, super quiet even when you're overclocking it to max. I really hope this happens because, you know, promises of overclocking, the classic one being the Fury X, where it's an overclocker's dream, and I couldn't get an extra 50 hertz, megahertz out of it. And it was like, oh, don't say these things. So I'm really hoping that that pans out, and obviously there's been a big bunch of AIB board designs leaked ahead of the reveal. So yeah, I'm going to be interested to see just how far the frequencies go. That'll certainly help the T-flops. And then it's all about the ray tracing. And I mean, there was some great stuff. You were talking earlier about Resident Evil 2 remake, which I thought just looked awesome. Really did look.
Yeah.
I really wish
Phenomenal.
we could show it, but we can't, unfortunately. But on the flip side, Assetto Corsa, Jensen was talking about shadows and reflections.
Yeah, that was an obvious one too. In car games, you're usually used to just like a certain level of fakery, and it just was all working reflections like you'd expect on the hood of a car, in the inside of the car, on the mirrors itself. It was pretty great.
Yeah, everything was running late at the event, unfortunately, so we didn't get a chance to see a bunch of stuff. We really wanted a closer look at Hitman.
That was
Hitman 2.
Or Metro, which was
Metro.
where I was a little saddened. So,
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to take a closer look at that soon. Any final thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm excited by the prospect of this. I'm glad we're finally reaching the point where it's becoming a reality, since it is, as they say, the holy grail of rendering. And this is a great first step.
I didn't expect this step. I honestly thought we'd still be waiting about 2 graphics card generations for normal rasterization performance to catch up, but Nvidia threw on some specialized hardware onto their chips, which I did not expect, and here we are watching real-time ray tracing in games, and that was hella impressive to me.
Your thoughts on Jensen's performance last night?
He was a real entertainer.
He's a great presenter.
He was so good, making jokes with himself and his staff. I had a good time.
Yeah, he stole the leather jacket from the 14-year-old me, though, so that was...
yeah, it's a little bit of a downgrade.
It was a downgrade compared to the
jackets.
post-Matrix jackets we've had in the past.
Yeah, this is post-apocalyptic now.
But still, it was all about the card yesterday, so he didn't want to, take over the spotlight there with the jacket. So you got to be careful with that.
I just thought the presentation was just awesome from start to finish, and he was really passionate about what he was presenting. And there was a real genuine effort to make something that's incredibly difficult to explain relatively easy.
I was really happy that he talked about recursive ray tracing and how it works, because I think a lot of people in the audience maybe didn't even know about that, and then hearing like, wow, there's actually different types of rays. Wow, this is super interesting. Caught my attention.
Well, I thought that was pretty awesome all around, and it's all going to come down to the products now, which we shall be looking at in due course. But I'd just like to thank both of you for joining me on this one.
Thanks a lot, Richard.
Thank you.
And thanks especially to Alex for his debut on-camera appearance.
That's right.
Okay, so we're going to leave things right there. Please do like and subscribe, as always, to support what we do. Ring the bell for instant notifications whenever a Digital Foundry video drops. And of course, if you like what we do, if you want to support what we do more deeply, please consider the DF Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. But that's all from us for now. Possibly more Gamescom video casts or voiceovers to come. And yeah, we'll keep you posted. Thanks for watching.
Cheers.
Ciao.